Hello, this is Mrs. Han from Campbell Junior High. Today I am going to be talking through the first section of our Medieval African notes with you. You should have received a note sheet from your teacher that will go along with this, and it should all go in order. So today we're going to be talking about geography and some of the Western African kingdoms. At certain points in this, you should be stopping the video and you should be filling out the note sheet that you've been given with the information that's on the slide. You will probably have to stop this video several times in order to get everything needed on your sheet. So the first slide we have here is going to talk about geography. Africa is the second largest continent in the world, and I love the map here where we see the continent of Africa, and you would also see the United States and how it fits in there. We often think that the United States is a very large country, and while this is only part of the United States, you may have noticed that Alaska and Hawaii are not included, just the continental U.S., but it is not really that big when you think about how large Africa is. Africa has many different climate zones, lots of geographical features. The main four that you will see in the continent of Africa are the grasslands, that covers a large area, the deserts. There are two major deserts, the Sahara and the Kalahari. Both are very large. If you remember when we talked about Egypt, we talked about how the earliest civilizations of Egypt were set up in the middle of deserts on the east and west. Rainforests, those are closer to the central part of Africa and near the equator. And then finally plateaus, these areas of high flat land. This map is looking at the different climate zones in Africa, and you can see that the north is pretty much almost all desert. We have some areas that are Mediterranean. They're going to be not as dry as the desert areas, kind of more humid, muggy feeling, and there'll be some different vegetation in those areas. Lots of savanna. When you see movies like The Lion King, that might be what you're picturing. Some rainforest as well. And so those are the four main ones that make up this continent. There are two major waterways, major rivers. There are more than two rivers in the whole continent, but the two major ones are the Nile, which we talked about when we discussed Egypt, and the Niger River, which is part of West Africa. And on the map here, you can see that it goes through several countries, including Nigeria and Guinea, as well as a tiny little bit of Sierra Leone. So the river is going to provide a lot for the people. Most people in early civilizations are going to start near rivers for the exact same reason why they started near rivers in China and in Egypt, is because the river helps give them good soil. It helps make travel and trade easier. They're able to be united. So the earliest people almost everywhere start near a river. So the first people to come up in Africa is a group called the Berbers. We don't necessarily know a ton about them, but what we do know is that they were trading and conquered by the Romans at one point. And when they were conquered by the Romans, one of the things that the Romans started using when they were in the areas was camels. And they used these camels for a couple different reasons. Their feet didn't sink when they were in the sand. They could store water for many days. So it was especially important when they were traveling through northern Africa. You just saw that map with all those deserts. And their humps were able to store fat for food. So they didn't really need as many resources as, say, a horse would need if they were traveling through the desert. So these groups got together and they eventually formed caravans. Remember, caravans are groups of traveling merchants. So these groups, they would have different products and would go from place to place. So all throughout northern Africa and the Sahara, they were mainly trading salt and cloth, but they were trading with other groups in Africa who were trading gold and ivory. Ivory is what comes from the horns or the tusks, of elephants. Today, we do not hunt elephants for ivory. It is illegal because they have been so extinct, but there are still people who do that. So this trade lets cities grow, cities like Timbuktu. You may have heard of that city before. And these four products were the main things to come out of those areas. The first civilization that we're going to talk about is Ghana. Ghana is a big deal because it became a huge trading city. or city and empire, excuse me, lots of different trade routes throughout this area. And many merchants and traders had to pass through Ghana to get from one place to another. And this made Ghana very rich because the Ghanaians forced merchants and traders to pay a tax. So if they paid this tax, they were able to control a few things, the Ghanaians were able to control a few things. So Ghana knew how to make some iron weapons, and they controlled the people who owned the gold mines. Ghana had a huge army, and the people wanted to trade items with at almost any price. So those first two things especially were really kind of scare tactics, like you have to pay these taxes that the Ghanaian people want you to pay. So there are several reasons why people would want gold and salt. First off, salt is used to preserve food. Think about it. There is no such thing as a refrigerator at this period in time. So they need to be able to store foods, especially meats, so that they don't go bad. They would pretty much engulf whatever meat they had in salt. Remember, salt pulls out the moisture out of the meat, and they're able to store it for longer periods of time. When they go back to eat it, they will put it in some sort of sauce or water and kind of, get rid of that saltiness and make it taste a bit better. On top of that, people do need some salt in their diet in order to live. Gold, on the other hand, this was a sign of wealth. It was very beautiful. It was used especially in jewelry pieces, but even in some artwork and some armor as well. So these are two pretty hot commodities. Salt would actually be quite expensive. It is a very difficult thing to mine salt out of the earth. It's very dangerous. So that would be a product that would sell for quite a bit. So one thing that drives the trade is scarcity. Scarcity is when you do not have enough of an item for what people need. So for example, right now, people are looking for toilet paper and paper towels, as well as, cold medicines, because people are getting really sick. So if you were to go to the store right now, those items would be scarce. You would not be able to find many of them. And they created this process, this silent barter process, where people will exchange goods without ever talking to each other directly, sometimes without ever even really seeing each other. So this is a really interesting trading idea. And this is how that silent barter process works. So first, these salt traders, they go to the riverbanks, the ones that are near the gold field, and they leave these large slabs of salt like you just saw on one of the last slides. And while they were there, they would beat these drums and let the gold miners know, okay, we're trading. It started. Salt traders, they leave their salt for the gold miners to come see. They step off for a few miles. The gold miners come. They check out how much salt's been left, and they determine what they think would maybe be a fair amount of gold to trade for the salt. The gold miners will leave the gold that they think is fair. They go back several miles, so they leave the spot as well. And when the salt traders return, they would look. If they were happy with the amount of gold that was left there, they would beat on this drum, and the gold miners knew, okay, it was a deal. The salt traders would take the gold miners would take the salt. Kind of an interesting process. Ghana's government. So as the trade increases and as they're getting all this money, they need to start gaining power, and they need to create some rules within their government. So they're not only just trading salt and gold, they're trading things like wheat, sheep, cattle, honey, leather, cloth, tassels, all sorts of things. And the gold that comes out of Ghana is the king's property. So that means the king of Ghana is richer than anybody else. So that means nobody else in Ghana was able to own any sort of gold. Whether you found a gold nugget or a larger amount of gold or even little gold flecks, all of that is supposed to be property of the Ghanaian king. Common people were only allowed to have, little pieces of gold dust, which is what you see in the picture here. So they continued to take over different lands, and at one time, Ghana was a massive empire in Africa. Eventually, like all civilizations, they do have a decline, and there are a few reasons for it. One was invasions. Muslim groups coming from the east and the north came and started cutting off trade routes. Another was overgrazing. These animals that they brought during these invasions, they ate up all the grass, and so there wasn't any more products there. They had lots of rebellion within Ghana. people who were unhappy with their leaders and go against them. And also, gold was outside of Ghana's control after it was discovered. So they struggled to maintain that superiority. The next one is Mali. And Mali is a super interesting empire to me. It starts here, well, they did take over Ghana, but Mali starts with a leader called Sundiata Keita. And Sundiata Keita was the son of a king. He's known as the Lion Prince by some. And because Africans didn't really write down their stories, they told them orally. Depending on who you're talking to, this story comes out a little bit different. So Sundiata was the son of a king. And he was born to the king and one of his second wives. And his first wife really didn't like this. And she treated Sundiata very poorly. On top of that, Sundiata was disabled. He couldn't walk without assistance, and he struggled a lot, especially as a kid. Eventually, he decided, enough is enough, and he left. Well, when he left, his empire was taken over by a very cruel king. Well, as Sundiata grew, he kind of grew and was able to be cured of his disability. And the villagers of his old empire begged Sundiata to come back. They begged him to take over and take control. And when he came back, he brought multiple different kingdoms that had also supported him. And they were able to take back his father's empire. So he became the first king of Mali. And he took control of salt and gold trade. He really brought them up. And he put soldiers to work in the fields, so he helped bring a lot of prosperity to Mali. The second one that we're going to be talking about is a man named Mansa Musa, and Mansa Musa is the richest person to have ever walked the face of the earth. They say, his wealth, if it was around today, would not even come close to comparing to the wealth of Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. Mansa Musa had way more money than either of those men did combined. One of the things that we know about him is that he was a devout Muslim. He worshipped Islam. And if you remember from our Islam unit, one of the things that Muslims must do is go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. So Mansa Musa needed to do this, and so he left his land and went all the way to Mecca, which is over in Saudi Arabia. Well, this took over a year for him to do. And while he was on this trip, he was spending money left and right. He was throwing money off to crowds. He was stopping and hosting parties. He was stopping and building libraries and temples and mosques and all sorts of these important buildings. Well, by the time he got all the way to Mecca and all the way back, and he had all of these wonderful adventures and parties and so on and so forth and built all of these amazing buildings, he really didn't have that much money when he came back. Well, as you can guess, this is going to make the people very upset, and some people are going to argue that he did not spend the money well. So even if you go into Mali today and you were to ask somebody, what do you think about Mansa Musa? Chances are they're going to say that they're not happy with him, because today Mali is a country that has a lot of economic problems, and a lot of people still blame that to Mansa Musa, even though it was hundreds of years ago. So a couple of the reasons why Mali fell. One, it just got to be too big. A big empire is hard for one person to maintain and take over. But another problem is poor leadership. Like I said, Mansa Musa made some decisions that weren't really, always maybe the brightest in terms of what's best for his people. The next one here I want to talk to you about is the Songhai. So the Songhai participated in the same gold and salt trade that made Mali and Ghana rich. Mansa Musa tried to conquer this area, and when the government grew weaker, the people of the Songhai regained their freedom, so it didn't necessarily work out the way he had planned. The leaders were Muslim, and so the Berbers who were trading in this area are more likely to trade with them. Here's a little bit about one of their important leaders, Sunni Ali. He's a Songhai leader who united, strengthened, and enlarged their empire. One of the things that he did is he added land to Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a very famous trading city, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that city in the coming weeks. So most of Songhai's traders were Muslim. Islam is huge in this part of Africa. Even today, many people who live there are Muslim. And so some of the laws are similar to those of maybe other Muslim nations because they still follow those 5 pillars of Islam, and that is their national religion. The Songhai end up falling when one of their leaders, he goes blind, he's forced off the throne, they lose some power. Morocco wants to be in control of their own salt mines because they need their own money. They start breaking apart from there. So Islam has a huge impact on Africa. Like I mentioned, a lot of African leaders are Muslim, so because of this, a lot of their written languages are based in Arabic. It's going to influence their slave trade. If you were to go to Africa, you might find many mosques that were built, people who are taught Arabic, who are speaking Arabic, and it also causes for some, civil action and civil trade between the Berbers and the Malayans and the Ghanaians. So that is helpful that, it allows them to trade a little bit more freely. But at times also it would cause conflict because some people stuck with their traditional African roots and their religions and others were converting. So some problems were caused as well by changes in religion. This is it for today. You may need to stop this and go back and take a look at it again, and that would be a very big help to you to prepare for coming back to school. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.